Hey guys, welcome to That Florida Feeling. How is everybody this week? I hope you're doing well. I hope you guys enjoyed last week's episode on Lily Poulter. That was a fun one for me, just because you always see her shops around. Thank you to everybody who has interacted with the social media pages. You guys are awesome. I'm glad that we all agree that one guy who came to Florida and got mad that it didn't look like the pictures was as rude as I thought he was. I do have the YouTube and the TikTok and all the other fun pages. So also the podcasts are on YouTube. So if you want to put it on in the background, or if you just like YouTube, check that out. You can also find videos on there of Florida as I roam the state. Also, shout out to my Unfiltered Studios podcast friends. It's a great network to be a part of, and there are some amazing people doing amazing things over there. So definitely check them out. You can find topics about everything. My favorites are probably Petals of Support by Mama D, Hypno Wellness with Cindy. Huge shout out to Sleevy G doing his thing. Of course, Stupid History Minute with Keb. I mean, there's sports ones, there's Unfiltered Sports on there, there's movie reviews, Movie Lovers United's on there. Like, if you are looking for a new podcast, you just need to check out Unfiltered Studios. Just check them out. You'll find a new podcast that you didn't even know you wanted to listen to. But thank you for coming back again for another episode of That Florida Feeling. You guys are amazing, as always. I would not be doing this podcast without you. So we're still in March. Somehow there's a hurricane out there. What the heck? We got an alert, and I'm like, no. I have at least 2.5 months. No, we're not doing this yet. Thank you. So, anyways. We are still in March, and we are going to talk about another amazing woman in Florida. And today we're going to talk about Zora Neale Hurston. Zora Neale Hurston was born January 7th of 1891, and she was an American writer, anthropologist, folklorist, and documentary filmmaker. She really portrayed the racial struggles in early 20th century American South. She also published research on hoodoo and Caribbean voodoo. Her most popular 4 novels are Their Eyes Were Watching God, and I have read that, and it's amazing. They were published in 1937. She also wrote over 50 short stories, plays, autobiographies, I can never say this word, anthologies, and tons of essays. I mean, she did amazing work. Now, Hurston was originally born in Alabama, and she moved with her family to Eatonville, Florida in 1894. She actually ended up using Eatonville as a lot of the settings for her stories. And in her early career, she used to conduct anthropological and ethnological research as a scholar at Barnard College and Columbia University. She had interest in African American and Caribbean folklore and how these contributed to communities' identities. She also tended to write about contemporary issues in the Black community and became a central figure in the Harlem Renaissance. Her short satires, drawing from African American experience and racial division, were published in anthologies such as The New Negro and Fire. She moved back to Florida eventually, after being in New York, and wrote and published her literary anthologies on African American folklore in North Florida, Mules and Men, and her first 3 novels, Jonah's Gourdvine, Their Eyes Were Watching God, and Moses, Man of the Mountain. Also during this time was Tell My Horse Voodoo and Life in Haiti and Jamaica, which kind of documented her rituals that she saw in Jamaica and Haiti. She has a ton of work. She is absolutely amazing. Their Eyes Were Watching God I recommend reading it. It's a really good book or novels. It's great. I had to read it in school, and I can't say that I wasn't extremely looking forward to it, but I was definitely drawn in. And because it's a classic of the Harlem Renaissance, and I mean, it really just talks about a teenage girl really finding her own destiny. And it's set in Florida. It's set in central and southern Florida in the early 20th century. It didn't do well to begin with, but it did great later on. Yeah, that's actually one of my favorite books, and I love that she wrote it, and it's really more interesting that it is actually centered in Florida. Now, of course, she was born in 1891. She was 5 of 8 children to John Hurston and Lucy Ann Hurston. All 4 of her grandparents were actually born into slavery, so she was really only one generation removed. Her father was a Baptist preacher and a sharecropper who later became a carpenter, and her mother was a school teacher. She was born in Alabama, which I cannot say it. I'm not even going to try to say that, but she was born in Alabama. Give me a second. Near Auburn. She was born near Auburn, Alabama. There we go, because I can't say the town. And she was born in her father's hometown, and her paternal grandfather was actually the preacher of the Baptist church in her hometown. But when she was 3, her family decided to move to Eatonville, which is actually right near Orlando. Like, Eatonville's just north of Orlando. They moved in 1890s, and what's great about Eatonville is in 1887, this was one of the first all-black towns to be incorporated in the United States. So Eatonville was really doing something back then. And Hurston has said that Eatonville was home to her, as she was so young when she moved there, so that's where she considered that was always her home. And sometimes she even claimed it as her birthplace, she said. Now, a few years later, in 1897, just after them barely moving there, her father was actually elected mayor of the town. And in 1902, he was actually called to serve as minister of its largest church, Macedonia Missionary Baptist. In 1901, though, some of the northern school teachers visited Eatonville and gave Hurston several books that actually is what progressed her into literature. It opened her mind, and she described this as her personal literary awakening, which is kind of cool. As an adult, Hurston often used Eatonville as the setting in her stories, and it was a place where African Americans could live as they desired and independently of white society. Like I said, it was one of the first all-black towns to be incorporated in the U.S. Another win for Florida on that one. And what's great is when she grew up in Eatonville, she did have that experience. And she actually described her experience in 1928 essay, How It Feels to Be Colored Me. And Eatonville actually holds an annual Zora Festival in her honor. Hurston's mother died in 1904, and her father married Mattie Moge in 1905. And this was considered scandalous at that time, partially also because it was rumored that he had relations with Moge before his first wife's death. And he was a Baptist minister, so you got to keep that in mind too. Hurston's father and stepmother sent her to a Baptist boarding school in Jackson, Florida, but she was dismissed after her parents stopped paying her tuition. So she's kind of forgotten, it feels like. In 1916, Hurston was employed as a maid by the lead singer of the touring Gilbert and Sullivan Theater Company. In 1917, she resumed her formal education by attending night school at Morgan Academy, now known as Morgan State, a historic black college in Baltimore, Maryland. So she's made her way out of Florida at this point. And at this time, to qualify for free high school education, the 26-year-old Hurston began claiming 1901 as her year of birth. She graduated high school in 1918. She did go to college. She actually learned how to view life through an anthropological lens, apart from Eatonville while she was in college, and one of her main goals was to show similarities between ethnicities. In 1918, Hurston began her studies at Howard University, which is a historically black college in Washington, D.C. She was a member of the Zeta Phi Beta sorority, founded for and by black women. She was also the first in her family to attend college, meaning that she was a first-generation college student. And while at Howard, she helped co-found The Hilltop, which is a university student newspaper. She also took many courses, varying from Spanish, English, Greek, public speaking, and even continued to earn an associate's degree in 1920. In 1921, she wrote a short story, John Redding Goes to Sea, and that actually qualified her to become a member of Alain Locke's literary club, The Stylist. Now, before leaving Howard in 1924, Hurston helped publish the inaugural issue of her school's newspaper. She also joined the Howard Literary Club, where she published her 2 first short stories. And despite success, Hurston paid for school by working as a manicurist in the evenings. Hurston was offered a scholarship by Bernard trustee and Nathan Meyer to Barnard College of Columbia University. She was the sole black student in this women's college. So this woman has done a lot of firsts. She actually assisted Myers in crafting the play Black Souls, which consisted of one of the first lynching dramas written by a white woman. So, and she continued to conduct I can't ever say the word, but she continued a type of research with an anthropologist of Columbia Research and later studied with them as a graduate student. She did receive her BA in anthropology in 1928. Because of her continued works, Alain Locke actually recommended Hurston to Charlotte Osgood Mason, a philanthropist and literary patron who had supported Locke and other African-American authors, such as Langston Hughes. However, she also tried to direct their work. Mason became interested in Hurston's work and supported her travel in the South for research from 1927 to 1932 with a stipend of $200 per month, which was actually a lot back then. In return, she actually wanted Hurston to give her material she collected about Negro music, folklore, literature, hoodoo, voodoo, and other forms of culture. So this really set Hurston up for another line of her documentaries. At the same time, Hurston still had to satisfy Boaz as her academic advisor, and Boaz was a cultural relativist who wanted to overturn ideas about ranking cultures in hierarchy of value. So she's working on a bunch of different things, but she's gaining a ton of information by traveling the South. After graduating from Barnard, Hurston spent 2 years as a graduate student with Boaz in Columbia University and actually living in Harlem in the 1920s. Hurston befriended writers such as Langston Hughes and Countee Cullen. Her apartment, according to some accounts, was actually the spot for social gatherings at that time. And around this time, Hurston had a few literary successes, including short stories and playwriting contest in Opportunity, a Journal of Negro Life, which was actually published by the National Urban League. Now, of course, as she's doing all this, she's not doing it alone. She did get married. She first got married in 1927. Hurston married Herbert Sheen, a jazz musician and former teacher at Howard. He later went on to medical school to become a physician. Unfortunately, that marriage was short-lived. They did not make it past 1931. While she's continuing her studies, though, in 1935, she was involved with Percy Punter, a graduate student at Columbia University. He actually inspired the character of Tea Cake. Oh my gosh. Okay, he inspired the character of Tea Cake in Their Eyes Were Watching God. Interesting. In 1939, Hurston was working for the WPA, which is the Works Progress Administration, which was part of the American New Deal Agency, which was where they gave a ton of people jobs kind of after the Great Depression. And that was in Florida, where she married Albert Price. The marriage actually only lasted a few months, but they didn't divorce for another 4 years. The following year, Hurston married James Howard Pitts of Cleveland. Again, only lasted a year. So she didn't have a lot of luck with marriage. But she did have a lot of luck with her works and, being able to be culturally relevant and important. And what's really great is that she did help establish a lot of things that people are still using today, such as in 1934, Hurston established a school of dramatic art based on pure Negro expression at the Bethune-Cookman College, which is in Daytona, later to be known as the Bethune-Cookman University, which is actually really cool because Bethune is still actually there today. In fact, I was just talking to a coworker. Her daughter's getting ready to go next fall, which is really cool. Actually, in 1956, Hurston received the Bethune-Cookman College Award for Education and Human Relations in recognition of her achievements. Words are hard today, guys. Which is really cool because the English department at Bethune actually remains dedicated to preserving her cultural legacy. She also joined the drama department of North Carolina College for Negroes, now known as the North Carolina Central University in Durham, for 1 year. And that's where she published her book, Moses, Man of the Mountain, which is really cool because, I mean, she's got so many great works. She's also taught variously at University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. You know, and I mean, this woman has done so many great things to show culture and to just show, to keep, well, it's kind of keeping it alive, you know, and to show the differences. But of course, her other thing was that she also worked in the field. She had a lot of anthropological and folkloric field work. And that's what's really cool, too, because she went out in the field and she traveled. She traveled extensively in the Caribbean and just the American South. And she got to know the local culture and practices as she did her research. Like, she didn't just watch it, she did it. And she based her work in the South, thanks to the sponsorship from Charlotte Osgood Mason. Hurston wrote Mules and Men in 1935, kind of based on this. She was researching lumber camps in North Florida and commented on the practice of white men in power taking black women as concubines and then having them bear children. The practice later was referred to as paramour rights, based on the men's power under racial segregation and related to practices during slavery times. Now, the book also includes a lot of folklore, but there's also a lot of, like, actual things. Hurston drew from this material as well in the fictional treatment she developed for her novels such as Jonah's Gourd Vine. So she got a lot of real-time, like, evaluations out in the field that she could use in her fiction, but she also put actual events in these books. In 1935, Hurston traveled between Georgia and Florida with Alan Lomax and Mary Elizabeth Barnacle for research on African American song traditions and their relationships to slave and African ancestral, and I cannot say that word, and whatever, a type of music. I can't say it, I'm sorry. She was tasked with selecting geographical areas and contacting the research subjects and then actually being able to talk to them about it, which she did. In 1936 and 37, she actually traveled to Jamaica and Haiti for research with support from the Guggenheim Foundation. And she drew from this research Tell My Horse, which is a genre-defying book that kind of goes through anthropology, folklore, and then a personal narrative all in one, which is something that wasn't really written at that time. And then in 1938 and 39, she actually worked for the Federal Writers Project, which is that FWP, which is part of the Works Progress Administration, which is after the Great Depression, getting people back on jobs, where they hired her because of her experience as a writer and a folklorist. And that's where she went and she gathered information to add to Florida's historical collection. They wanted to, like, go out and they wanted to know about, like, the history of Florida and the culture of Florida and the, you know, like the Florida crackers and the settlers and the people who were here before. And her job was to actually go out and to talk to these people and to collect it and to write it and to keep it. And that's, you can still find that to this day. And I think that's really, really cool. Because we wouldn't have that if she hadn't done something like that. You know, she also got experiences to be able to go live in Honduras, to, you know, look for Mayan ruins, to, you know, and that's awesome. I think that, you know, she got to do all these great experiences. And yet every time she did this, she always set them in Florida. Now, really, during her last decade, she worked as a freelance writer for magazines and newspapers. And in the fall of 1952, she was contacted by an editor of Pittsburgh Courier to go to Florida and to cover the murder trial of Ruby McCollum. Now, Ruby McCollum is another interesting person that I'll probably end up doing an actual podcast on. But basically, Ruby McCollum was a wealthy married African-American woman who lived in Live Oak, Florida, and who was charged in 1952 for first-degree murder of killing Dr. C. Leroy Adams, who was a predominant white doctor and senator-elect. So, this was a huge trial in Florida, because this is a wealthy black woman accused of killing a predominant wealthy white doctor. And so McCollum was charged with killing, with the murder of Dr. C. Leroy Adams, who was a politician. And McCollum had said he had forced her to have sex and bear his child, which is that practice that, Hurston had talked about in one of her later books. So, they had asked her, can you go, cover this trial? And Hurston recalled that she had seen of white male sexual dominance in the lumber camps in northern Florida and discussed it with him. And they both thought the case might be, more about paramour rights. And so, yeah, she wanted to do it. She wanted to expose it to a national audience. Well, upon reaching Live Oak, Florida, Hurston was surprised not only by the gag order that the judge put on the trial by the defense, but also nobody in town would talk about this case. Everybody was silent. Blacks were silent. Whites were silent. Nobody wanted to talk about it. And she thought that it might have been related to Dr. Adams' alleged involvement in the gambling operation because of Ruby's husband, Sam McCollum. I mean, her articles were published in the newspaper during the trial, and unfortunately, Ruby McCollum was convicted by an all-male, all-white jury and sentenced to death. Now, Hurston had a special assignment to write a serialized account, the life story of Ruby McCollum, over 3 months in 1953 in the newspaper. Her part ended abruptly when she and Nunn disagreed about her pay, and she decided, you know what, you're going to have to pay me or I'm not doing this. So she left. Unable to pay independently to return for the appeal and second trial, Hurston contacted journalist William Bradford Hugh, with whom she had worked for in the American Mercury, to try to get him interested in the case. And he actually covered the appeal and the second trial, and also developed material from a background investigation. Hurston shared her material with him from the first trial, but he only unfortunately acknowledged her briefly in the book Ruby McCollum, Woman in the Swanee Jail, which actually became a bestseller. But Hurston actually celebrated the fact that this got covered. She felt that this was a win. McCollum's testimony in her own defense marked the first time that a woman of African American descent was allowed to testify as to the paternity of her child by a white man. Hurston firmly believed that Ruby McCollum's testimony sounded the death toll of paramour rights in the segregationist South. And you got to understand that was in the 1950s. 1950s. Just keep that in mind to this day. And Hurston continued to work. She worked at the Pan Am World Airways Technical Library at Patrick Air Force Base, which is Titusville? Brevard County. So, towards Titusville, Melbourne. But unfortunately, she was fired in 1957 for being too educated at her job. I have actually experienced that. But she moved to Fort Pierce, Florida, taking jobs where she could find them and working occasionally as a substitute teacher. At age 60, Hurston had to fight to make ends meet with the help of public assistance. And at one point, she worked as a maid on Miami Beach's Revo Alto Island. During a period of financial and medical difficulties, Hurston was forced to enter St. Lucie County's welfare home where she had a stroke. She died of hypertensive heart disease on January 28, 1960, and was buried at the Garden of Heavenly Rest in Fort Pierce, Florida. Her remains were actually in an unmarked grave until 1973. So for 13 years, nobody knew that this remarkable woman was in Fort Pierce, Florida. Novelist Alice Walker and fellow Hurston scholar Charlotte D. Hunt found an unmarked grave in 1997 in the general area where Hurston had been buried, and they decided to mark it as hers. Walker commissioned a gray marker that said, Zora Neale Hurston, a genius of the South, novelist, folklorist, and anthropologist, 1901 to 1960. The line, a genius of the South, is from Jean Toomer's poem, Georgia Dusk, which appears in his book, Cain. Problem, though, is that Hurston was actually born in 1891, not 1901, but she claimed that to get free schooling. After Hurston's death, a yardman who had been told to clean the house was burning Hurston's papers and belongings. What an idiot. A law officer and friend, Patrick Duval, passed the house where she had lived, stopped, put out the fire, and saved invaluable literary documents. For 2 years, he stored them until he and a group of friends could archive the materials. This collection was given to the University of Florida in 1961 by a friend and neighbor of Hurston's. Within the collection is a manuscript and photographs of the Seraph of Swanee, which is a novel, and an unpublished biography of Herod the Great. Luckily, she donated some of her manuscripts to the James Weldon Johnson collection of Yale University, and other materials were actually donated in 1970 and 71. In 1979, Stetson Kennedy of Jacksonville, who knew Hurston through his work with the Federal Writers Project, also added additional papers that he also had. So her literary career spanned many years, and she has a ton of credits to her name, and she was one absolutely amazing woman that called Florida home. She is often remembered as part of the Harlem Renaissance and for being a first of many. She did intend to publish a collection of several hundred folk tales and field studies from the South. She wanted them to be as close to the original as possible, but she always struggled to balance the expectations of a story versus the real thing. And so that's what they found. They found tons of these writings that she never could quite balance. Hurston's manuscript, Every Tongue Got to Confess, in 2001, a collection of folktales gathered in 1920, was published posthumously after being discovered in the Smithsonian Archives. In 2008, a Library of America selected excerpts from Ruby McCollum's Woman in Swanee Jail, to which Hurston had contributed, for inclusion in a 2-century retrospective of American true crime writing. Hurston's nonfiction book, Barracoon, was published in 2018. A barracoon is a type of barracks where slaves were imprisoned before being taken overseas. In February of 2022, a collection of Hurston's nonfiction writings, You Don't Know Us Negroes and Other Essays, edited and Henry Louis Gates Jr. and Genevieve West, was published by HarperCollins. So she is still living on to this day. In chapter 15 of Dust Tracks on the Road, entitled Religion, Hurston actually expressed disbelief and disdain for both theism and religious belief, though. It's very interesting, as much as she saw. She always said that prayer seems to me as a cry of weakness and an attempt to avoid by trickery the rules of a game as laid down. I do not choose to admit weakness, and I accept the challenge of responsibility. Life as it is does not frighten me, since I have made with my peace with the universe as I find it, and I give in to its laws. However, although clearly an atheist who firmly rejected Baptist beliefs as her father was a preacher, she retained interest in religion from an anthropological standpoint, as she did investigate voodoo and did participate in rituals alongside her research subjects. In another of her original uncensored notes in her autobiography, she does share admiration for biblical characters like King David, saying he was a man after God's own heart and quite serviceable in helping God get rid of a no-count rascals who were cluttering up his palace. So, now, unfortunately, her work did kind of slide into obscurity for decades for both cultural and political reasons. And her novels became less popular. Young writers felt that it was demeaning to use the dialect she had used or the type of fiction that she had chosen. Also, Hurston had made stylistic choices in dialogue that were influenced by her studies that were no longer popular. But several of Hurston's literary contemporaries also criticized her use of dialect, saying that it was a character of African American culture and rooted in post-Civil War white racist traditions. These writers, also associated with the Harlem Renaissance, criticized Hurston's later work as not being advanced enough. Which, I mean, I don't know. Like, if you read The Eyes Were Watching God, it's set in a certain time and it makes sense. You know, I mean, in the late 20th century, there was a revival in her work, and critics have praised that speech because it does show how that speech was. So, you know, looking back now, I think it was great that she did preserve that speech. And she, you know, I think it's great. I think that if you look back at anybody's work in that time, it's great that they preserve that. And it's great that she was able to do that, especially as a female writer, as an African-American female writer, especially at that time. She's had tons of posthumous, I can never say it. She's had tons of after-death recognition. Words are killing me today. Her hometown of Eatonville, Florida, actually continues to celebrate her life annually. She even had a library named for her in her honor in January of 2004. The Zora Neale Hurston House in Fort Pierce is actually designated as a National Historic Landmark. I have actually seen that. It's a quaint little house on Avenue L. It's nothing fancy. In fact, if you blinked, you'd miss it and you wouldn't know what you were looking at. But it's actually very cool. Alice Walker was the author who helped to install her grave marker. Alice Walker also published In Search of Zora Neale Hurston, which gave her reviving interest in her works. She was inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame in 1994. Scholar, in 2002, a scholar, Asante, listed her as one of his greatest 100 African Americans. Bernard College dedicated its 2003 Virginia C. Gildersleeve Conference to her. The Zora Neale Hurston Award was established in 2008. It's awarded to American Library Associate members who demonstrated leadership in promoting African American literature. She was inducted as a member of the inaugural class of the New York Writers Hall of Fame in 2010. So she's got tons of awards that I wish that she could have seen, because she was an amazing woman. She definitely had a lot of first. She definitely stood her ground and did her rights. And, you know, she's actually still talked to about in this day. You know, the 2004 film Brother to Brother was set part of the Harlem Renaissance, and it actually portrayed someone playing Hurston. The Eyes Were Watching God was actually adapted for a film in 2005. So that's kind of cool. In 2017, Jackie Kay presented a 30-minute BBC Radio 4 documentary about Hurston called A Woman Half in Shadow. You know, in the 2017 film Marshall, Rosanda Thomas plays Hurston. And in 2017, the documentary Zora Neale Hurston Claiming a Space was presented on PBS. And she definitely holds a place in Florida literature, as she continues to be set in Florida literature, because that is all of her settings. And she definitely shows what Florida used to be like. So I was very happy to talk about Miss Hurston as a Florida woman during Women's Month. And I'm sure in her time she encountered some absolute idiots that she would have called Florida man, definitely during her time. And today's Florida man actually comes out of Clearwater, someplace she might have visited but probably didn't talk about, as it probably wasn't as bad as it was today. Today's Florida man is from Clearwater. He apparently got mad at a broken karaoke machine and just decided to fire shots at it, because that's going to fix it. Yeah. So what do we do when we get mad? We just start shooting things. No, we don't. No, let's not do that. It took place on Sunset Point at one of the bars that I used to drive by every day and After seeing that bar, it doesn't surprise me that somebody shot the karaoke machine there. So, I hope you enjoyed hearing about an amazing woman in Florida. If you have a suggestion for the last one, let me know. I do have an idea, but I'm always open to suggestions. Or if you want to hear just a topic about Florida, let me know, guys. I'm always open to it. I hope you guys have a great week. Be nice. Don't shoot karaoke machines, guys. Drink your water. Wear your sunscreen. And as always, that's your daily dose of sunshine.
This podcast is a production of Unfiltered Studios. If you would like to know more about joining Unfiltered Studios, please visit our website at unfpod.com for more information.